In this video, we're going to take a look at Backlog Refinement, one of the Scrum ceremonies. First of all, why do we refine? Well, we know the project management body of knowledge says that we should get estimates from experts when we're planning out a task. And this is true whether it's waterfall or agile or anything in between. We want to get expert opinions because experts have that experience, and it's less likely that we're going to forget something. So we want to, when we refine, we typically are going to take advantage of everybody's experience. So we want to have the entire team together. This isn't a matter of one or two people in a room. It's the entire team and all of their output and all of their input into the process. So we also want to make sure that stories are complete so that we know that they're ready to be worked and that someone won't start on it and then realize there's some missing data and then come back and have to fix it. And we want to have a common understanding of stories, which is also why we tend to have the entire team present in a refinement. So good time to double check, do we have the requirements met? Do we have acceptance criteria? Do we have everything that should be in the ticket present? So from scrumalliance.org, they define backlog refinement as determining what's the desired outcome of the story, who's it for, what value will it create, and what problem are we trying to solve? So the next question is, when do we refine? Well, fairly frequently. It doesn't necessarily have to be on a specific cadence with a sprint because we're typically planning out work for future sprints. And refinement could happen once a week or twice a week, depending on the stories that we have and what it is that we wish to refine. What's the outcome? We want to have clear tickets, clear understanding, and that means complete tickets. So we want to make sure that tickets have met our standards and they're ready to work. And we'll talk about what a definition of ready is in just a moment. Now, we'll typically define things with relative complexity with Fibonacci numbers. So Fibonacci number, you take the current number and the previous number, add them together, and that makes the next number. So 1 plus 1 is 2. 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 8 plus 5 is 13, 13 plus 8 is 21. Why Fibonacci numbers? Well, we kind of have to make a decision with Fibonacci numbers. We can't say, let's just split the difference, because you see these numbers, there's not really an easy middle ground between a lot of these numbers like 8 and 5. But if we stick to these, we can kind of have an idea that a 1 is a very straightforward task. A 21 is a massive task. So the analogy that we see many times is that a 1 might be learning to walk or roller skates, where a 13 would be building an airplane and a 21 would be building a spaceship. So we're looking at relative complexity. Now I have to reinforce something very important here, which is that the numbers we assign are not aligned to time. So we don't think that a 3 is 3 days work or a 3 is a day of work or anything like that. It's a relative complexity. Now let's consider something else as well, which is as we get more experience, does that relative complexity change? So in other words, consider this scenario. We decide we're going to make a new user interface screen in an Android application, and we say, okay, that's a fairly complex thing. We're going to say it's 5 story points. Well, we don't get to that particular feature for a while. And 2 years later, we get to that feature and we say, okay, well, we pointed this at 5 story points, but you know what? We've gotten a lot better at making screens. We have a lot more experience with it. We understand the UI editor for screens and we know how to make the most of it. So is it still a 5? The answer is yes, it's still a 5. The complexity doesn't change. So how do we reflect our greater productivity and our greater efficiency? And the answer is velocity, which is the sum of story points for a sprint. So we want to keep those story points consistent. We want to keep that complexity consistent throughout time because that lets us look at velocity as a measure of productivity gains. And we know that we can increase velocity in many ways. One is through experience. One is through better tooling and techniques. A lot of different ways we can, but probably one of the biggest is the retrospective meeting, which is different from the refinement. They sound similar, but they're different meetings. The retrospective is where we look back and say, okay, what did we do well that we want to continue doing, what was not effective that we want to stop doing, and what do we want to start doing that we haven't done that might be more effective. So the retrospective oftentimes is about an hour meeting at the end of the sprint, and it feels like, all right, you're putting everyone in the room and they're not working. But actually they are very much, because that retrospective allows us to air our concerns and discuss how we can do better. And that's how we improve productivity. We can prove that out through velocity. Worked with a colleague one time, colleague I deeply respect. And he thought retrospectives were a waste of time. And I told him, okay, but if you don't do the retrospective, you're not going to have that increase in velocity. So we can actually measure the effectiveness of the retrospective by looking at velocity. So how do we prepare for a refinement? We'll typically write stories in advance, and our tool of choice could be Microsoft Project, GitHub projects, or very commonly Jira. And typically a product owner, one who understands the business needs, will write a story that is very much functional. So as a user, I want to be able to take a picture of my plant along with the date and record information about what I did to the plant, so that I will have a history of maintenance for that plant. Something like that. So we're thinking high level. On the other hand, we might have developers come and say, we really need to refactor this. Why? Well, we wrote this originally when we had on-prem data storage, and now we've moved to the cloud, and that really changes things, and boy, we can make it a whole lot more efficient if we just refactor this module. Okay, write up a story. So that's a technical task that would typically be written by developers. So anyone can play in here. There can be quality tasks as well. Really, anyone can play. It's just a matter of what's the right story for that person to write. So we want to have a valid definition of ready. And the definition of ready says, okay, this ticket is ready to be worked. Definition of ready is something that the team will come up with together to say, if a ticket has all these criteria, it's ready to be worked. Now, don't confuse that with the definition of done, which is very similar. Definition of done is after the work is done on a story. We say it's done because it meets these criteria. Code compiles, unit tests are written, unit tests have 80% coverage, it's been code reviewed twice, quality has done a check. Those are things, or accessibility as well, internationalization. Those are things that are in a definition of done when we're complete with a story. But when we start working a story, we want to make sure that that story meets the definition of ready. And typically, we want to meet that definition of ready at or right before this time of refinement. So team will come up with them. They'll vary, but typically they'll have these components. Requirements are written in the story. Acceptance criteria are clear. Storyboards are attached for UI features. Testing criteria is present. Story is pointed, which we'll do during refinement. And then we know that the work is valuable and aligns with our outcomes. Each organization might have different needs. If you're writing software for an international clientele, you'd likely have internationalization needs written in there. So maybe some things around that. I talk about mobile app a lot, but maybe we're thinking API. So where a mobile app would say, let's have a storyboard, or basically a screen mock-up for UI screens. Service might be considering, do we need to look at unit tests? Do we need to look at, do we need to look at performance tests? Do we need to look at penetration testing? Do we need a cybersecurity audit? So those are things that might be a little more particular based on the type of work that you're doing. So with that, that is one of the more important Scrum ceremonies. Of course, a lot of important Scrum ceremonies. But in our next video, I will walk through an example refinement. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.